Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar, How to Get Essential Nutrients on a Raw Plant-Based Diet. We're super excited to share with you today important and often overlooked information on two essential nutrients that can potentially lead to challenges with raw food, plant-based, and any other type of dietary approach. We want you to reach your health goals and are happy to provide you with information that can help you reach them while avoiding dietary pitfalls. This webinar is the first in our summer webinar series, Transcending What's Trending. We've found in our collective 60-plus years of personal experience, as well as our research, education, and clinical experience, that it's so easy to be pulled in different directions depending on the prevailing trends in the health world, and that education is the greatest predictor of success on a raw food and plant-based diet. For those of you who don't know us yet, I'm Dr. Karen Dina, and you'll be hearing from Dr. Rick Dina in a few minutes. We're both chiropractic physicians with a strong interest in plant-based and raw food nutrition, as well as the functional medicine approach to health. We're board certified and licensed in the state of California. We've also hosted raw food summits for the past 4 years, where we have interviewed successful, healthy, long-term raw vegans to share with you how you can be successful on this path over the long term as well. We're also the authors of the Raw Food Nutrition Handbook, the developers of the Science of Raw Food Nutrition series of classes that we taught in person for 10 years, and the developers and instructors of the Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online and interactive program, which we'll share more about later on this webinar. From this and speaking at many conferences and events over the years, we've become known for our thoroughness and scientific accuracy, our ability to make complex subjects easy to understand, and our encouraging approach that takes unnecessary hurdles out of people's way. Before we continue, we would like to let you know that the information and opinions expressed by us in this webinar are not intended to be used as medical advice and should not be used to diagnose or treat any medical condition or as a substitute for individual care. This webinar is presented with the understanding that Drs. Rick and Karen Dina, us, are not liable for misconception, misuse, or adverse effects resulting from its use. Any type of dietary change, nutritional therapy, or fasting should always be undertaken with the supervision of a qualified healthcare practitioner. We may end up being those healthcare providers for you, but watching this webinar does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. The menu plans in this webinar are for educational purposes only. So now we'd like to share with you a little bit about what inspired each of us to start on this path in the first place. First you'll hear from me, and then you'll hear from Dr. Rick. I found raw food at a time when I was experiencing notable fatigue, for which there was allegedly no answer. I was in college at the time, and I was sleeping 10, 12, and sometimes more hours per night, and I'd wake up feeling like I still needed more sleep. I saw 3 medical professionals, and after multiple lab tests and evaluations, I finally had a diagnosis: fatigue of unknown origin. They had a whole list of everything that I didn't have, but could not pinpoint the source of my fatigue. I asked every single one of them if my fatigue may have had anything to do with my college diet and lifestyle, and they all emphatically said no. I started reading and researching different healing systems, which eventually led me to a whole food plant-based dietary approach, and when I implemented that, my fatigue improved. But when I learned about and implemented a raw food plant-based diet, my energy soared beyond the impressive improvements that I had experienced by eating just a whole food plant-based cooked diet. Long story short, my fatigue vanished along with a variety of other symptoms that I'd had for years, and I had more energy than I knew what to do with. I started to look healthier. I slept better. I enjoyed exercising and my digestion improved. I was so inspired by the health results that I was experiencing that I felt compelled to learn more about the inner workings of the human body, nutrition, and the diet-health connection. I really wanted to immerse myself in learning as much as I could, so I read lots of raw food books. I attended conferences and lectures and gatherings, and I talked to lots of different people about their experience. I even listened to a local raw food radio program. All of this was great, but I really wanted much more depth and detail. I wanted to find out why I was able to get so much better. I was totally on a mission. I went back to school to earn a second undergraduate degree in biology, and I received doctorate-level education in naturopathic medicine and chiropractic, which helped me to put everything that I had observed into perspective and on a much deeper level. During this time, my fatigue recovery was totally put to the test. I received an academic scholarship for my biology degree, but I was totally on my own for all my other expenses, so I had to work half to full time along with studying for my academically rigorous classes. And I had to keep up my GPA to maintain my scholarship. On many days, I would go to school, and then I'd go to work, and then I'd study for a few hours, and then I'd go to bed. And then during my naturopathic and chiropractic education, I had a similar schedule. I attribute my ability to keep this schedule for as long as I did to my raw food diet. When I think back to my pre-raw days, there's really no way that I would have been able to keep this type of schedule. I was just so inspired and motivated by my results with raw food that I stayed on this formal educational path for over a decade, knowing that I would have the education and experience to make a difference in people's health with this solid educational foundation. Now, I've learned a lot through my research, education, clinical, personal, and teaching experience, so over the years, I've refined and revised my approach to raw food and tailored it to my individual needs. And with the educational opportunities that Dr. Rick and I have developed and teach, we can show you how to do this too. And speaking of Dr. Rick, next, he'll share a bit about his background and experience with raw food and plant-based nutrition with you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning into our webinar. Now that you've heard from Dr. Karen, I'm going to share with you just a few relevant pieces of my history and my background that led me to where I am today with whole food, plant-based, and raw food nutrition. So I ate conventionally growing up, and for the most part, I was a pretty healthy kid, with the major exception of some hay fever allergy type issues that developed about mid-elementary school. So what would happen is every spring, and then secondarily in the fall, my nose would drip, sometimes hours at a time, sometimes all day. My eyes would get red and itchy and watery. And worst of all, when this was going on, I would feel completely drained of energy, totally exhausted. Several days a year, I had to miss school and work, and I even missed an entire year of playing Little League baseball. Moving on to my freshman year in college, I gained the classic freshman 15, but I already had a 15-pound head start from high school. And here we have a picture of me with that extra weight, and I was having a pretty bad allergy day at the time as well. And it really motivated me to want to start making some changes to my diet and lifestyle to see if I could feel better. So I started to make some significant changes after my freshman year in college, or starting near the end of that. And over the summer, before my sophomore year, I lost about 15 pounds of extra fat. I really felt so much better that I kept reading and kept learning and kept implementing. And about a year after that start, I switched my diet to vegan, all vegan, and mostly raw at about the same time. That brought my health up several levels, and I've maintained about a 90% raw diet ever since then. So here's a photo of me when I was a few months into being raw and vegan, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. Again, I felt so much better than I did about a year before. So I wanted to keep learning as much as I could. I read books, magazines, went to conferences, listened to audio programs in the car while I was driving, and just filled myself up with as much information as I could. My junior year in college, I fasted on water only for 14 days while living in my college dorm. That was in the winter, and in addition to so many other benefits, I noticed when that spring came along, I had almost no allergy symptoms. I was just absolutely blown away and so impressed. That fueled my motivation to keep learning more and more. In fact, later on my junior year, when it was spring weekend and there were bands and parties and all sorts of fun things happening on campus, I drove several hours to attend a raw food conference, and I've never regretted that decision ever since then. Moving on to some continued history, back in 1991, I worked at Hippocrates Health Institute. Later that year, I went to work for the Juice Man Company. I was part of the support team that flew around the country and set up events in hotels and sold juicers and told people about the benefits of juices and fresh fruit and vegetable-based diets. It's a lot of fun. Sometimes a crowd would gather around while I was explaining things, and I just thought, hey, this is cool. So no wonder years later, I'm speaking to you now on this webinar. I still wanted to keep learning more in as much depth as I can, so I went back to school to earn a doctorate degree in chiropractic, where I was learning all of the foundational sciences and getting things in just exponentially more depth than I understood them before, and things are really, really coming together. That gave me the opportunity to go out to Northern California and be on staff as a fasting doctor, which I did for 4 years, and I gained such a wealth of clinical experience, not only from seeing the fasting patients, but having that doctorate background, as well as learning from more experienced doctors. That just brought things again to a whole new level. Just for fun, here's a picture of me when I was at True North. That was 12 years in now to being a vegan. Now, I was so much in my element there, teaching people about nutrition and seeing what happens with fasting, but I actually left after 4 years because I was young and emotional and I was in love. So I moved to be with the woman I fell in love with. I actually moved up to Seattle, Washington. And while I was there, I put together a program that I taught at Bastyr University for naturopathic medical students. And as it turns out, that woman who I fell in love with was Dr. Karen. And so we had there was a good outcome there. We teamed up. And later on, skipping a few years, we developed a curriculum called The Science of Raw Food Nutrition, and we taught that in person for 10 years. And then after that 10 years of teaching in person, we updated, improved, and expanded that into our online Mastering Raw Food Nutrition program. Also, since about 2011, I have been in clinical practice where I work with people regarding lab work and dialing in their diets who are interested in raw food and vegan paths, and that oftentimes gives me a much different perspective compared to just reading journal articles that we do a lot of and put together and make sense. So all of this comes together in our curriculum, and for those of you interested, we're going to talk more about the details of that at the end of this webinar. In the 30 years that Dr. Karen and I have each been on this path, we have seen so many trends come and so many trends go in the plant-based, raw food, and general health fields over this time. But what has always been consistent, no matter what or who was trending at the time, is that when people add more fresh fruits and vegetables and other whole natural plant foods to their diets, while simultaneously decreasing, or better yet, eliminating processed foods, all sorts of health benefits can be realized. as many of you have heard so many examples of in our raw food summits over the past 4 years and in other places, and maybe for many of you in your own experience as well. We sincerely want all of you to be able to understand the most important concepts and practices so you can achieve extraordinary health no matter who or what is trending at the time. We truly want all of you to be trend-proof. So many times when something seemingly new comes on the scene, we think to ourselves how incredibly important it is to have a strong, solid foundation in a scientifically valid perspective of nutrition so you can make sense out of what you see and what you hear. With this foundation, you are so much better equipped to be able to distinguish what is valuable from what is not. So an example from class. So after about 6 hours worth of some really intensive in-depth study and analysis of fatty acids and essential fats and omega-3 conversion, where we look at a bunch of case histories and go through all different foods and diets and really analyze everything really thoroughly, on one of our weekly conference calls, a student raised her hand and said, "Okay, Dr. Rick, I want to make sure I understood this." And she was explaining everything, and I was very proud of her. She was getting it all right. And then she put that together with a YouTube video that she had seen with somebody explaining why they've now left the movement. And fatty acid imbalance and not having enough DHA was one of the movements she cited. And our students said, "Oh my gosh, here's what we're learning in class. Here's what this person said. And if only this person had that solid foundation, they never would have had to leave the movement in the first place because they could have gotten what they needed within the raw vegan realm and therefore continued to get all the benefits from it." So I was very proud of my student, and it's a really good example. So you can't just go to Dr. Google or earn a PhD from YouTube and think that you've got it all covered. If this was true, then we would see more people staying in the movement these days than compared to before social media came on the scene. But in fact, it's just the opposite. So when you have the truly solid foundation, this allows you to stay on track and truly achieve a lifetime of supercharged health. And once again, that's what we want for every single one of you. Having said that, let's now move on to our topic for this webinar in our Transcending What's Trending series.
And now we'll discuss how to get essential nutrients from whole natural plant foods. And if you've been involved in the raw food, vegan, and plant-based community for any length of time, you've likely been asked the ever-popular, "Where do you get your?" types of questions. And we'll answer some of those questions for you here today. Our first nutrient is iron. Now, what is iron exactly? We know that it's an important nutrient, but more specifically, iron is an element, and therefore it can be found on the periodic table of the elements. Now, I know that this table may strike a memory of your high school or college chemistry class, hopefully a positive memory. I can remember back to my first day of chemistry class in high school, and I was amazed when my teacher put up the periodic table of the elements here. But the way that he described the periodic table of the elements got me really excited, because he said, "Look at this, if you know anything about nutrition, every element or every mineral can be found on this table." So that made the class very, very interesting. And from that point on, I was totally hooked on chemistry and science. So there's iron right there, as you can see. Now we know that iron is an element, and for nutritional purposes, we can call it a mineral. It's involved in a number of activities in the body, including the formation of red blood cells. And in red blood cells, iron is involved in carrying oxygen from our lungs to our tissues and carrying carbon dioxide from our tissues back to our lungs, where it can be exhaled as a waste product. Essentially, iron plays an important role in the oxygenation of our tissues. Sometimes when people are low in iron and they have an iron deficiency, then their body's ability to oxygenate its tissues is compromised. So sometimes these people may experience fatigue. Now, when I was experiencing fatigue in college, an iron test was one of the things that I was given. As it turned out, I was not iron deficient, so my doctors looked on to other possibilities. Now, other functions that iron is involved with in our body would include energy production and immune system function, among other functions. There are two main dietary forms of iron, and perhaps you've heard of them. One is the heme form, and the other is the non-heme form. The heme form is found in animal foods and supplements. Now, when I say animal foods, I'm mostly referring to red meat. Now, many different supplements that I've seen contain the heme form of iron, and how I can tell this is by looking on the supplement bottle or container in the ingredient list. And if I see the words ferrous sulfate, then that means that the supplement contains the heme form of iron. Now, the non-heme form of iron is a type of iron that is found in plant foods. Now, I don't know if you've heard this, but many times I've heard people say that the iron that's found in animal foods is more easily absorbed than the type of iron that's found in plant foods. And my answer to that idea is this. It's a little bit more specific than that. As it turns out, the form of iron found in plant foods is more selectively absorbed than the iron in animal foods. And what that means is that with the non-heme form of iron, the iron status of the person affects absorption. So this form of iron is absorbed more readily when it's needed by the body and less readily when it's not needed, which is actually really good because iron is a really important mineral, but we don't want too much of it. Now, the heme form of iron is less selectively absorbed, which means that the body absorbs this form of iron whether or not it needs it. Having enough iron is important, but too much can be problematic. Now, there are some substances that we find in some foods that can bind to iron and make it less usable by the human body. Oxalic acid, also known as oxalate, is one of those substances. Oxalate binds to iron and certain other minerals, making them less bioavailable to our body or less useful to our body. Oxalates are found in a number of foods, but certain foods are very high in oxalate, making them not a good source of iron. Examples would include spinach, rhubarb, Swiss chard, beet greens, and parsley. It's important to note that these are not bad foods, they're just not good sources of iron, especially when they're raw. Many of these foods actually have a lot of iron, but most of that iron is bound to oxalate and is therefore not usable by our body. Now, it's important to note that oxalate will not steal iron or other minerals from our body, and that's good to know. Here's a table showing the oxalic acid content of some of the foods that we just mentioned. And as you can see, parsley, chives, purslane, spinach, and beet greens are much higher in oxalic acid than the others that are further down on the chart. Now, it's difficult to avoid oxalic acid altogether, but if we focus our diet on lower oxalate foods, less of our dietary iron will be bound to oxalate and will therefore be more available for use by our body for important processes like the formation of red blood cells and assisting with carrying oxygen from our lungs to our tissues. Once again, focusing one's diet on lower oxalate foods, such as those that are listed here on this table, can increase the amount of bioavailable iron in our diet. These foods are good sources of iron and are low in oxalate and would include kale, dandelion greens, broccoli, romaine lettuce, bok choy, and many others. The foods on this table are just examples. Now, I mention them here because they're popularly consumed on raw food and plant-based diets. I've seen people focus on spinach as their main leafy green, without knowing that much of the iron in spinach is bound to oxalate. This is one of the reasons why I encourage people to include a variety of leafy greens in their diet, rather than just focusing on one or two. On this table, we see that 3 cups of chopped kale contains 3.42 milligrams of iron, and 2 cups of dandelion greens loosely packed contains 3.41 milligrams of iron. These numbers are excellent. If we compare these amounts to the daily value for iron, we see that they're impressive. The iron recommended dietary allowance for men and postmenopausal women is 8 milligrams and 18 milligrams for premenopausal women. Some non-leafy green sources of iron are listed here on this table. We see that chia seeds, sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds, and hemp seeds also contain significant amounts of iron. In addition to oxalate, phytate is another substance found in certain foods that can affect the absorption of certain minerals. The good news is that we cover both oxalate and phytate in our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online course. We also cover other nutrients that can actually help enhance the absorption of certain minerals, like vitamin C. Now, it's very interesting to see the nutrient content of individual foods, but how much iron do we find in foods when they're eaten together? We have an example here of a medium-sized salad that has 4 cups of romaine lettuce, 2 cups of dandelion greens, 1 cup of grated cucumbers, 1 cup of grated carrots, and a cup of chopped tomato. And we have a simple dressing with 1 tablespoon of sesame tahini and 1 tablespoon of fresh squeezed lemon juice. All of these ingredients have a total of 9.3 milligrams of iron. This is excellent when we compare to the RDAs for iron. Once again, the iron RDA for men and postmenopausal women is 8 milligrams and 18 milligrams for premenopausal women. From this salad and dressing, we have exceeded the iron daily value for men and postmenopausal women, and we have made a significant contribution to the daily value for premenopausal women. Here are some photos of the salad and dressing. As you can see, this salad is the size of a mixing bowl. Now for us, this is a medium-sized salad. And now, Dr. Rick will share with you some clinical considerations regarding iron.
The most well-known test for determining the iron status in the human body is known as the complete blood count. In many other English-speaking countries, it can also be known as the full blood count. In Spanish, it's known as the hemogram. In Portuguese, as the hemogramma. No matter what it's called, though, there are several measurements within that can help determine the iron status of the body. Now, we're just going to look at a few of these in this very brief overview of a complete blood count. A few years back at a raw food festival, I gave an entire presentation for an hour just about the complete blood count, and it could have been a lot longer than that. So again, just a few tidbits here. We're going to look at hemoglobin. Dr. Karen mentioned hemoglobin earlier. We're going to look at the red blood cell count. We're going to look at something called hematocrit, and we're also going to look at the size of the red blood cells. After that, we will give a couple of examples where we can see the iron status in somebody's blood, as well as the ferritin level in someone's blood, because that is the storage form of iron in the human body. So to take a quick look here, Dr. Karen mentioned how hemoglobin is the oxygen-carrying part of a red blood cell. So if we take a look at this little window here, we can see a hemoglobin molecule. And the globins are these protein chains. The heme contains iron in the center, and there are 4 iron atoms per hemoglobin molecule. So that's over 1 billion iron atoms per red blood cell. And when you consider that we have about 25 or so trillion red blood cells in the body, each with over 1 billion iron atoms, that's a lot of iron, and it's really, really important that we are obtaining enough of it. In fact, 65 to 70% of the iron in the human body is in hemoglobin found in red blood cells. So by measuring hemoglobin, we can see if we have enough iron, because if you don't have enough iron, you cannot make enough hemoglobin. Of those trillions and trillions of cells, of red blood cells in the bloodstream, here is a picture of a few of those, and the lab technicians can actually count how many red blood cells there are in a specified amount of total blood. Now, a different way of measuring that is something called hematocrit. And hematocrit is when you take a certain amount of blood and you spin it down so the red blood cells that are heavier go to the bottom. Then what you do is you say, of the total blood volume, what percentage of it is made up of red blood cells? And that number is known as hematocrit. So it's the volume of red blood cells as opposed to the number of red blood cells. And each of those measurements are actually very useful in their own way. So let's take a look at the complete blood count, or a few of the complete blood count numbers of a sample long-term raw vegan female. And as we can see here, the red blood cell count, the number of red blood cells per amount of blood, microliter in this case, is solidly in the middle of the range. For hemoglobin, we are solidly in the middle of the range. So we know with an extremely high degree of certainty that this patient has enough iron, because otherwise they could not have an adequate amount of hemoglobin. Hematocrit is 40, okay, solidly in the middle of the range. 40% of the volume of their blood is composed of red blood cells. And we have some other interesting things here that are cool to explain, but we're going to keep things moving. Now, even if I never saw an iron level on this patient, I would know from these numbers that their iron status is excellent. But in this particular case, we did see their iron stores traveling through their blood, as well as their ferritin stores, which is the storage form of iron, and both of those are good. Now, you can see that each of these are near the lower end of the reference range as opposed to the upper end. And that is not uncommon to see in people on plant-based diets for the reasons Dr. Karen explained. And in this particular case, I happen to know this patient's history because it's Dr. Karen. She's never been anemic, including, as she mentioned, when she had serious fatigue as a college student. And we'll shift over here to finish up to a sample long-term raw vegan male. Happens to be me. And we can see that red blood cells solidly in the middle of the range, hemoglobin solidly in the middle, hematocrit solidly in the middle. You may notice these numbers are a little different for men and women. The size of the red blood cells is right in the middle of the range too. Same for Dr. Karen's. We both got 91. Now, let's just go back a moment. And if you do not have enough iron, you can't make enough hemoglobin. If there is not enough hemoglobin, you can't stuff every red blood cell full of as much hemoglobin as it would like to have in there. So then what happens is the size of the red blood cell gets smaller. So when you see a normal red blood cell size, that's another very solid indicator that the iron status is good. And if we can take a look at my iron and ferritin levels, they're both, iron's near the upper end of the range, and ferritin's, somewhere between halfway and at the upper end of the range. Now, usually when I've measured those numbers on myself, they are lower. This time they were higher, but no matter what my iron and ferritin levels have ever been, I've never been anemic, and that's good to see. In fact, it's actually pretty rare to see anemia in people on vegan diets. On the few occasions that I've seen that happen, almost every time, it's been because they're not consuming enough vegetables in general, and then their main vegetable is usually spinach. So we hope you enjoyed this clinical tidbit about iron in addition to what Dr. Karen shared with you, and now we'll move on to vitamin B12.
The next nutrient that we're going to cover is vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is also known as cobalamin. It's essential since the body does not make it, and it's needed for important body functions, including the formation of every cell in our body, because it's involved in genetic code replication. When a cell divides to form a new cell, all of the DNA from the mother cell must be replicated perfectly for the forming daughter cell, and vitamin B12 plays an important role in this process. Vitamin B12 is also involved in the maintenance of the covering of nerve cells called the myelin sheath. Myelin helps with the propagation of nervous system signals through neurons, and in a vitamin B12 deficiency, that myelin can become disrupted, leading to neurologic symptoms that we'll talk about shortly. Vitamin B12 is also involved in serotonin production. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter or brain biochemical that's involved in creating the moods of happiness. Vitamin B12 also keeps homocysteine levels appropriately low. Now, homocysteine is related to heart disease, and vitamin B12 breaks it down. Homocysteine is also a vitamin B12 test, which Dr. Rick will share more about shortly. Given all of the important activities of vitamin B12 in the body, it's not surprising that there are a number of deficiency signs and symptoms that one should be aware of. I always tell people that it's best to get tested for vitamin B12 before any of these appear. It's also important to note that these signs and symptoms are not exclusive to vitamin B12 deficiency and may occur with other types of health challenges. But if a few of these are present, it would be prudent to check one's B12 levels. Some of the other signs and symptoms that people may experience with vitamin B12 deficiency are listed here on this slide. For example, numbness and tingling and burning sensations in the hands and feet. That's called peripheral neuropathy. Now, sometimes, if these sensations move inward towards the spine, then one may end up with tremors or poor coordination. That's a very long-standing B12 deficiency. Now, there's lots of other signs and symptoms that can come up too. In B12 deficiency, there may be decreased serotonin, which may lead to cognitive challenges and depression in some people. Elevated homocysteine levels in vitamin B12 deficiency may be contributory to cardiovascular disease because of its inflammatory properties. I know that vitamin B12 is a huge topic of conversation in the raw food, vegan, and plant-based communities. But I like to mention that vitamin B12 deficiency is not just an issue for vegans, vegetarians, and raw foodists. My classic example is the Framingham Offspring study. Now, this study was published in the year 2000, so this information is not new. It's been around for quite some time, and it's well understood. In this study, there were almost 3,000 people, and 39% of them were low, normal, or deficient in vitamin B12. And what was fascinating about this study was that the study participants were not vegan or vegetarian or even raw foodists. They were all omnivores. They were all eating animal foods. Now, this surprises people because oftentimes animal foods are thought to be good or reliable sources of vitamin B12, but this study shows us otherwise. Vitamin B12 is a concern for everybody. I tend to be more concerned about vitamin B12 with meat eaters than with vegans because vegans tend to be well educated about vitamin B12. Very often I'm asked about food sources of vitamin B12. How reliable are they? Are fermented foods a good source of vitamin B12? And what about seaweed? Can these foods have vitamin B12 in them? And the answer is that some fermented foods have vitamin B12, but not all. So fermented foods are not a reliable source of vitamin B12. Now, since vitamin B12 is made by certain types of bacteria, the fermentation mixture would have to contain this bacteria, which is not reliably the case. Most studies I've seen have shown that fermented foods are not a reliable source of vitamin B12, and the same is true for sea vegetables. Studies that I've seen that were done on nori seaweed reveal that freshly harvested nori contains human bioactive vitamin B12, but once the nori is dried, the human bioactive B12 is converted into B12 analogs, which are molecules that look like vitamin B12 but don't have the same activity in the human body. Unfortunately, rehydrating the nori does not reactivate the vitamin B12. This is likely where some of the confusion with vitamin B12 and sea vegetables comes from. But what about the vitamin B12 that is found in our large intestine? That's a really good question. Now, if we take a look down here on our slide, we see that we have a stylized picture of our digestive system. And this green structure here is our large intestine. The orange structure is our small intestine. Now, the vitamin B12 that is found in our digestive tract is largely found in our large intestine. Now, the challenge is that vitamin B12 is absorbed in the last part of our small intestine, called the distal ileum. And everything in our digestive tract moves in one direction. So our food comes from our stomach into our small intestine and then moves into our large intestine and then out of our body. So unfortunately, the vitamin B12 that lives in our large intestine cannot be absorbed in our small intestine because it doesn't move backwards. So unfortunately, we can't utilize the vitamin B12 that is found in our large intestine. So, what is the most reliable source of vitamin B12? The answer is supplementation. Now, if someone has trouble absorbing or is very deficient in vitamin B12, their doctor may have them get an injection. Now, there are several different forms of vitamin B12 available in supplements, and here is a sampling: methylcobalamin, cyanocobalamin, and hydroxocobalamin. Hydroxocobalamin is the form of vitamin B12 that is found in nature. If someone eats a food with hydroxocobalamin in it or takes a hydroxocobalamin supplement, the body takes the hydroxo portion of the molecule off and replaces it with a methyl group, which activates it, since methylcobalamin is a human bioactive form of vitamin B12. Now, cyanocobalamin is one of the most common supplemental forms. It has a long shelf life, so it can sit on a shelf for years and still work. When someone takes a cyanocobalamin supplement, their body will remove the cyano group and replace it with a methyl group to activate it. So both cyanocobalamin and hydroxocobalamin can be converted into a human bioactive form. Now, methylcobalamin is already human bioactive in the form that you get from supplements. Now, what form do we use? We use methylcobalamin, which we've been using for years and have experienced good results. Now, one way to know if your vitamin B12 supplement is working or if you're getting enough from your diet is to get a vitamin B12 test, which Dr. Rick will explain next.
There are a number of different tests that can be utilized to determine the B12 status of a patient. We see 4 of the major ones on the slide here, and each one has their advantages and their disadvantages. Now, we've already mentioned the complete blood count, otherwise known as full blood count or hemogram, earlier when we talked about iron. So because we're already a little familiar with that, let's start out with that. So Dr. Karen mentioned that vitamin B12 is involved in creation of new cells. Like I mentioned in the iron section, because we have 25 to 30 trillion red blood cells, and they need to be replaced every 4 months. That is, those millions and millions of new red blood cells need to be replaced every single day. If you are low in B12 and you don't have enough B12 to activate folate to produce new cells, a low red blood cell count is usually the first major place that that problem can be detected. For a couple of other reasons, or different reasons, the size of your red blood cells gets big. So if you are anemic from iron deficiency, we mentioned the size of your red blood cells gets small. If you are anemic from B12 deficiency, the size of your red blood cells gets big, and that's a major distinguishing factor between those two major types of anemia. Now, Dr. Karen made a video on her YouTube channel showing that even if you are low in B12, if you consume much larger quantities of folate than the average person, which those of us eating raw fruits and vegetables is the foundation of our diet do, you can actually have enough activated folate even without B12 to keep pumping out new red blood cells, and you can head off that potential problem with anemia. Now, on the one hand, that sounds good, but on the other hand, that's not so good because you think everything's fine, and then years down the road, you can end up, if you're low in B12, with one of those major neurological problems that Dr. Karen mentioned, and you don't want to deal with any of those. I've seen some of those clinically, and they are not at all good. Maybe my favorite test here, one of them is serum B12. Sounds straightforward enough. Actually measure your B12 level. Now, the problem with that is that if somebody's consuming foods like spirulina, for example, that may contain B12 analogs, the test can get fooled, and B12 levels will look good in your blood, but those analogs don't actually function like B12. So over on the right, we have some of the fancier B12 tests that measure the functional status of vitamin B12. And the first one here is homocysteine. Homocysteine is supposed to be low. When you're deficient in B12 or B6 or folic acid, and there's some other considerations as well, homocysteine gets elevated. That's a problem because homocysteine irritates and causes inflammation in our blood vessel walls, and that can lead to vascular disease. It's a major contributing risk factor for vascular disease, which can lead to heart attacks, strokes, claudication, TIAs, angina pain, erectile dysfunction, and other things that people can do without. So if homocysteine's elevated, you don't know for sure which one of these nutrients you're low in. But in my practice, because I deal with mostly vegans and raw vegans, it's pretty unlikely you're going to be low in folate or B6, so you're pretty sure at that point it's B12. Now, if homocysteine is low, then you know your status of all three of these nutrients, including B12, is excellent. Lastly, we have methylmalonic acid, which can be measured in the blood or the urine, and unlike homocysteine, B12 is the only nutrient that affects methylmalonic acid. B12 is involved in demethylating, taking a methyl group off of methylmalonic acid. So if methylmalonic acid is elevated, you know that your B12 status is not good, even if your serum B12 level says it's okay, because you might be getting fooled by analogs there. So methylmalonic acid is a very sensitive indicator, and it is very useful, and I use all of these tests in my clinical practice depending on the situation. Now, one other thing I'd like to mention for serum B12 is that if your vitamin B12 status is good or it's excessive, homocysteine and methylmalonic acid will both be appropriately low. They can't tell the difference between enough B12 and an excessive amount. Neither can the CBC. But the serum B12 test can tell you that. So if you see really high levels of B12, well, that's not going to be harmful because B12 is water soluble and it's not toxic, but it may mean you're over supplementing and you can save yourself some money and some plastic going to the recycling center by cutting back on your vitamin B12 level. So that can really help you dial things in. There's so much more to talk about each of these tests in relationship to vitamin B12, but we hope you have enjoyed this little bit of an overview, and in combination with what Dr. Karen taught us, you're a little bit more educated now about the importance of vitamin B12 and how to test for it so you know if your status is good or if it's not so good. In today's webinar, we covered just a little tiny bit of the information that's available to those of you who would like to continue on your journey learning with us. Before we tell you more about how you can do that, we'd like you to consider the theme of our webinar series this year. We truly want all of you to be trend-proof, or at least very trend-resistant. Why? Because for those of us who are motivated and willing to make meaningful dietary and lifestyle changes, misinformation is probably the single largest hurdle to the process of achieving excellent health. No matter what you eat, there's someone out there to tell you why it's bad. We have the great fructose scare causing people to avoid really healthy foods like fresh fruit. We have people telling us we have to severely limit our fat intake to be healthy, and others telling us we have to eat mostly fat to be healthy. There's even people who warn us against eating vegetables. So look, folks, we are pro-fruit, pro-vegetable, and pro-fat, but all in healthy proportions within the context of an overall healthy diet and lifestyle, matched up with your individual tastes, desires, personal preferences, and individual biochemistry. Now, another trend I've seen over the last 8, 10, 12 years is that someone is actually really achieving excellent health and they're feeling great and enjoying things. But then somebody comes along with some misinformation and makes them question what they're doing. And then this actually throws them off track because they just can't get past what this other information is saying. When you are really well educated, you're so much less susceptible to this happening to you. So for example, what if somebody tells me I don't get enough protein? Well, I'm not thrown off track because I know from experience I can build muscle pretty easily. And I know the science behind the claims and I'm covered. What if they tell me there's too much fructose in the fruit that I'm eating and I'm going to develop obesity, fatty liver disease, and diabetes? Well, I know my glucose, A1C, insulin numbers, liver function tests, and my percentage body fat, and they're all really healthy. What if they tell me I need fish for DHA? Well, I know my DHA levels. I know the science behind it. I know that I'm not insulin resistant. I'm not suffering from depression or brain fog. You can't knock me off track because I'm too well educated. How about raw cruciferous vegetables and thyroid function? Over the last 32 years, I've consumed almost 10,000 heads of raw cauliflower and lots of kale and collards and some broccoli and cabbage here and there too. And I know my thyroid function's excellent. And so again, education has made me very much trend-proof and erroneous claim-proof. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have people telling us we should be fruitarians, or we don't need to practice good dental hygiene because animals don't brush their teeth, or there's no such thing as a B12 deficiency. Well, I'm educated enough to know those things aren't true either, and they're important factors to pay attention to to achieve excellent health. And when you have that level of education that leads to that level of confidence, you can truly achieve a lifetime of supercharged health. Our curriculum, Mastering Raw Food Nutrition, is designed to do exactly that. It's a 12-month online and interactive program, and our next group program begins on August 28th of 2019. There's a time commitment of 2 to 4 hours per week. So if you can commit a few hours a week for a year, cover the tuition costs, and make sure you follow through and pay attention and participate in the class, you can dramatically increase your chances for lifetime health and have a really fun time in the learning process as well. I'm first going to tell you a few of the topics that we cover in the course, and then we'll go into how it is actually delivered. So we cover a huge array of topics in our curriculum. Pretty much everything you ever wanted to know about plant-based and raw food nutrition, or even nutrition in general, based on our decades of personal research, course development, education, and clinical experience in this field. So we cover calorie density, blood sugar regulation, one of my favorite topics. Dr. Karen covers raw food sources of so many nutrients. And as you can see here, some examples: calcium, vitamin D, vitamin B12. Go into essential fats, one of my favorite topics. Acid-alkaline balance, cleansing. Where do you get your protein? Human digestion, enzymes. Longevity and youth extension. We look at a bunch of long-lived populations around the world. We look at a bunch of cellular mechanisms of physiology to put two and two together and figure out how it all works. We look at health statistics, the history of raw and living foods, different approaches to raw food nutrition, food combining, raw food weight loss connection that builds upon what we learned from calorie density, classic studies in support of plant-based nutrition. We cover Pritikin, McDougall, Ornish, Esselstyn, Barnard, so much Dr. Campbell's work, the classic data that's there. And we actually have about 4 hours worth of that. We go on then to look at why we think there are some additional advantages to more raw foods in your diet, as long as you're there in the whole food plant-based realm. So we cover various substances that form when we cook foods, depending on the food and the temperature and the cooking method and the time. And, we go into all the details there. We talk about nutrients and how heating changes nutrient levels. And yes, we cover beta carotene and lycopene very thoroughly. Moving on, Dr. Karen takes advantage of her biology degree and looks at different plant families and different foods and how that affects nutrient levels. And you really start to put two and two together. Let's see, different points of view on Candida. Dr. Karen looks at DHA in terms of xenoestrogens and phytoestrogens, and then that combines with my advanced fatty acids section, where we look at things like omega-3 conversion. And by the way, after 6 hours of going through all the fats, that's when the student I mentioned earlier in the webinar put two and two together and realized why someone who had left the movement didn't need to if they were educated in the material we talk about in this class, for example. Survey of superfoods. Dr. Karen goes through all the science and looks at marketing claims versus scientific reality and gives you a fair, accurate assessment so you know which one of those things might be helpful and which ones are just a bunch of hype. She expands on nutrients, raw food exaggerations, history of human food choices, another Dr. Karen section. Did our brains get big because of meat and fat consumption? Was it from cooked carbohydrates, starches? Was it from fruit? She objectively looks at all of those competing theories and makes sense out of them in the context of what we should be eating in the 21st century here today. Animal products, menu planning, more raw food weight loss, carbohydrates and expanded view. Dr. Karen goes through all of the different types of sweeteners out there. Now, we don't think you should be consuming many of those, but some people like to use some. It's good to know what you're dealing with. Research in support of raw food nutrition. That's a many-hour section over a few weeks. Some people say there isn't science and research to support raw food nutrition. Absolutely not. They just don't know where to look. Nutrient analyses of, it's so incredibly thorough. Then we start talking, we just build upon everything. An overview of energy. This is where Dr. Karen looks at questions like, does all fructose turn into fat in the liver? Does it all turn into body fat? We go through the metabolic pathways, but in an understandable way, and we make sense out of all this stuff. Advanced functions of dietary fiber, leading into probiotics and prebiotics, leading into the human microbiome. And even before that word was buzzing and trending, we laid the foundation to make all of this stuff make sense. Overcoming challenges and pitfalls in raw food nutrition. There are so many of them. And then near the end of the course, for those of you who are interested in going out and educating others, we have some built-in educator material. We actually give you some presentations. You can see it says your name here. You fill in your name, and then we show you how to modify and personalize your presentations. So you've got a structured, really excellent, solid presentation, but you personalize it so it doesn't seem canned. And then we handle how to handle audience members, credibility, topics, putting an event together, building an audience. We've got the basics of internet marketing there. So for those of you with a desire to go teach and coach others, this is incredibly valuable information. Most of our students, however, are not in that camp. They just want to learn this information for themselves and their friends and their family. And for those students, this section near the end brings all of this stuff together and integrates it so well. And when you get questions from your coworkers, your friends and family, you're able to handle those with confidence so you can take a leadership role instead of feeling like the weirdo. And so basically, by the time you finish this course, our students' level of understanding about a whole food plant-based diet with a foundation of raw fruits and vegetables is at a very, very, very high level, much higher than most of the people educating out there today. And there's so much they appreciate from the thorough and unbiased perspective that we share. Our bottom line position is that all you have to do is tell the truth, and the benefits of plant-based and raw food nutrition are naturally revealed. No outrageous claims, nothing crazy, just amazing health supporting results. Couple of quotes from our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition students last year class. So Diane says, "Hello, Drs. Rick and Karen. I am so thankful to have been in your class. It has really been a guiding light through the maze of food information. Your scientific preciseness in evaluating what is hype from the real truth has been a real help. The detail and depth of the presentations are way beyond what I expected and are a real example of how to evaluate truth from error. Thank you for being so honest and teaching how to be critical thinkers, a skill for all of life's endeavors. Thank you all for your conscientious teaching." Now, Diane is somebody who has been on this path for longer than us. She's got a long history with this, but just like so many other people, all of this stuff coming at us today is causing confusion and eroding confidence, but we're so happy to hear from her that she is back to feeling really confident about what she's doing and has made some additional distinctions to bring her health up a few levels. A doctor from Indiana in our couple year ago class says, "Medical research has turned into this avalanche of new facts and theories. I think the course gave us ways to do our own research directly and start making more of our own decisions on what to believe." And I actually forgot to mention it previously. Let's get back to this section. So Dr. Karen here has a section called Searching for Science-Based Health Information. This is where she turns her experience as starting as a research assistant And doing all the research that she's done over the years, she actually teaches you how to find credible scientific information out there and make sense out of it so you can continue the learning process long after this class is over. We are always so happy when other healthcare professionals join us for the class. We've had medical doctors, nurses, people with PhDs in physiology, chiropractic colleagues, naturopathic doctors, dietitians, etc. join us. They always appreciate how accurate the science is, but at the same time, let me make it very, very clear that our course is designed for people without a science background, so everything is easy to understand. So Denise from Ecuador said, when I decided to take this course, I already had a certification in plant-based nutrition and mindful eating. So certification, not a doctorate degree. I decided I needed to know more so I could understand my body and restore my health and also help others. This course was very useful, very easy to understand. Doctors Rick and Karen are great teachers. And she said, thank you. And Denise, you are more than welcome. It was literally our pleasure. Now, as far as the way the course itself is delivered, we have put a huge amount of effort into making very high quality videos, somewhat comparable to what you're seeing here on this webinar, where you have a PowerPoint presentation and either Dr. Karen or myself giving the presentation with our high quality microphones here, so it's easy to follow along with. We have about 2 hours per week of videos, and over the course of the year, that's about 100 hours worth of video content. You can watch those videos on your own schedule. So they're there the whole time, and once we release each new set of weekly videos, they stay there for the entire course because things build upon the stuff before, and we keep building and integrating and adding to the picture and seeing how it all fits together, so you can always go back and review everything. Now, each hour of that content, when we put this curriculum together, once we were already in 20 or so years to our paths and had earned doctorate degrees, had done lots of research, had had our own clinical experience, once we got to that point, every hour that you see in our course was about a full-time week worth of research, investigating, thinking about how to spell it out so it makes sense for everybody, making charts and graphs and putting the PowerPoints together so you don't have to spend thousands of hours and years worth of time trying to figure things out. It is all condensed down, and it is an incredibly efficient use of your time because we know that people's lives are busy. Each video is typically broken down, or each 2 hours is usually broken down into videos of 20 to 30 minutes to make it easy to watch a segment at a time, or just to, keep going through all of them. We also provide for you some very comprehensive notebooks. There are 4 notebooks that we physically mail to you throughout the course of the year. That's about 900 pages worth of notes. And these notes are designed to complement the videos. So if you have your notebooks open while you're watching the videos, you don't have to try to write everything down as quickly as possible. Although if you do want to write something else down, just hit pause, take a few notes, and continue on. But the majority of what we say on the videos and the majority of what you see in the presentations are actually in the notes for you. So that way you've got the notes there, you can watch the videos and really pay attention so the information sinks in, so you understand it, so you can use it. Everything is designed with our students in mind. And I'm going to see if I can make myself bigger here. And I'm going to take a look over here. And if you give me just a second, I'll show you a couple of samples of one of our notebooks. And so here we have Dr. Karen's section. Let's see if I can line that up with the camera on the connection with vitamin B12 and folate. Here we have a section on essential fats. We can see near my thumb there the different types of fats and the different shapes that they are. Let's see. We go into omega-3 and omega-6 food sources. We've got inflammatory considerations. There's omega-3 conversion. The next section after that is pH balance. So here we have some more from Dr. Karen. And basically everything's laid out in logical bullet points so you can see and follow along. It took an awful lot of effort for us to put this together, to think it through, to coordinate it with the videos. But once again, it's all designed to help you understand what you are seeing. And our students have told us over and over again how much they appreciate having those notebooks, because once the course is over, they are lifetime reference material. And again, many of our students have told us they refer to them frequently when they want to look things up again and figure things out and review. Another one of our students, Rhonda from South Carolina, tells us, in today's world where most people have no true understanding of nutrition and how our bodies function, this should be a required course for all high school students. We think for everybody for that matter. With an obesity epidemic skyrocketing, studying what foods the body needs to stay healthy and thrive would change the direction of the next generation. And we could talk a lot about that. We are absolutely on the same page with Rhonda, and we love when our students start to really see that big vision and how much of a difference those of us who are properly educated can go out and share, and how much of a difference that can make for people. So we talked about the videos that you watch on your own schedule. You've got the comprehensive notebooks that complement the videos to enhance the learning process. We also have conference calls. They're on Tuesdays. We have 6 to 8 of those per month at 2 different times on Tuesdays to cover people from different parts of the world, because we have students from all over the globe. And that is where you meet with us in small groups with your fellow students and ask questions about the course content and get feedback directly from us to help clarify, make sense out of things, and make sure you're understanding what you're seeing, and for us to be there for you. We don't just plop a bunch of stuff down on you and say, okay, you're on your own. We're there for you every week, except the last Tuesday of the month we take off. So even if you can't make a particular call, we've got it set up so you can type in questions in advance or even during the call. And on the calls, we go back and forth between live questions and written in questions. We answer those to the best of our ability, and then we record and save all of the calls so you can ask questions in advance. And then even if you're not there on the call, go after and listen to the recording, and you've got everything covered. It's not quite real time, but it's still direct interaction with us. And our students really, really appreciate having that interaction on those conference calls. Kim from Decatur, Georgia, said, after being vegan for 18 years, I was very indecisive about mastering raw food nutrition, especially with the time and cost involved. I'm so glad that I decided to take the class and feel that the education I gained is well worth the time and money spent. I now have a great understanding of the importance of raw foods and which should be included daily, supplementation, medical test requirements, and foundational and research background. This class really cuts through all of the rhetoric, and that's so very true. She also said, I loved the all-encompassing, non-judgmental, down-to-earth manner you both have. I felt very welcomed to participate in the calls. Speaking of those calls, I immensely looked forward to the videos and calls each week. Thank you both for this education and experience. And Kim, you are more than welcome. So in addition to the videos, the notebooks, and the calls, we also have a Facebook group. And that's where students get to know each other a little bit, general community support. And we found over the few years of teaching this course online now that the Facebook group really comes in handy at maybe half of our conference calls. When we're answering questions, we will post some additional supporting information in the Facebook group. So it might be a link to an article about, heavy metals and sea vegetables, or something relevant to the course discussion. It might be a journal article reference or something else that we use, again, to support the question. So the Facebook group really comes in handy as well. You're not required to be in the Facebook group, though, if you don't want, because some people have legitimate concerns about their privacy with all going on with Facebook today. But it's a private group. No one else is in there. It's pretty safe. We have yet to have any type of problem. So that explains the basic ways that the course is put together. Now, in terms of Dr. Karen and I, on the one hand, we expose you to many, many different topics and ideas. Like you saw in those slides, you saw the thumbnails of some of our videos in the course. So the thing is, though, we are a married couple and we're both very enthused about what we're doing. So on the one hand, we're different people and you get a different perspective, but we're very well integrated. So all of that material integrates together in the curriculum. You see how it all fits together as a whole as we keep building and expanding and adding more things in. It's very, very cohesive. And that's just so, so important, because one of our primary goals is to cut through the confusion so all of our students understand things. And yes, we're pretty nerdy, but again, that's to your advantage, though. And to my knowledge, we're the only dual doctorate degree couple in the raw food community, or I think in the plant-based community. Now, if one's a doctor and the other makes recipes, we have no criticism with that, but it's really cool when Dr. Karen reads something or I read something and we're trying to figure things out. We can talk to each other about it, and there's so much synergy in that because we're both understanding things at a very deep level. So you put all this together and it is a winning combination. Laura from Mexico said, "This has been the best journey of knowledge in the path of a healthy life. Many of my doubts have been clarified with scientific support. In this world where so much false information is shared, it's imperative to have the truth. Mastering raw food nutrition is a great opportunity to learn and understand in the best way." She also said, "I really love the way you've put together the course. Both have a clear speaking voice that helped me understand pretty well. Thank you." And Laura from Mexico, like many of our students, are from all over the world, and English is not their first language. So over and over, we've heard that people can understand us well, and that's when people are, from, again, all over the world, and so that's really helpful. So if English is not your first language, you can probably still do well in the course. If you're following this webinar, you'll be able to follow the course, and you can always hit pause and go back and catch up. And we're really happy to hear Laura's comments. Tim from Canada said, "I had just recently become a raw vegan a short time before starting the course. For me, the course was a lifesaver. I am the only one I know who has taken such a dramatic dietary change, and no one around me knew anything about it or could help me along the way. It was tough listening to friends and family asking so many questions and basically saying I was crazy. The course was there to educate me, and in time, others began asking me questions about health. A fantastic course to help anyone who wants to improve their knowledge on how to be healthy." And we know that Tim's health improved dramatically based on what he learned in the course. And Tim's a great example of someone who he already has a full-time career, and he wanted to learn about this information. But when people asked him about it, he had solid information to share with them. So over time, he didn't seem so crazy. Laurențiu from Romania said, "This course gives systematic and structured information loaded with examples and studies that can help understand better the need to eat vegan and the benefits of a raw vegan lifestyle." And Carla from the UK said, "I have learned so much from this course. Dr. Dina's break down the information without bias and give you pure scientific facts. I love what I have learned from this course, and I am so glad I chose this course over IIN. That's a whole other big discussion. There are other programs out there. Various ones have their advantages and disadvantages. So to summarize, our program covers 2 hours of professionally made videos per week. You have thoughtfully designed notebooks for each subject, 4 notebooks overall that we mail to you, near weekly conference calls, and a Facebook group for support. And it's all designed to help you understand this information so you can achieve a lifetime of supercharged health. Remember earlier when I showed you the photo of when I was overweight and having a bad allergy day? And based on the way I felt, I was motivated to make some changes? I made the decision to change my course, and I am so happy that I did. Now it's time for you to make a decision. You're watching this webinar because you're interested in plant-based and raw food nutrition and in taking your knowledge to the next level so you can supercharge your health and maintain it for a lifetime. At this point, you've already got a really good idea if you want to continue your learning journey with us. Our next group program begins in late August, and once it fills, it won't be offered again until the summer of 2020 and likely at a higher price. You can watch the course videos on your own schedule and re-watch them as many times as you'd like. This gives plenty of time for the information to sink in. And then in addition to the comprehensive set of notes to help you follow along with the weekly videos and to be lifetime reference material, we also have the almost weekly question and answer sessions in real time in small groups directly with us. Or like I mentioned, you can type your questions in advance and listen to the recordings afterwards, so close to real time. The Facebook group is also there to support the learning process. We love connecting with our students and will be there with you the whole way for all 12 months. You can access this course anywhere you have an internet connection, which is most places on the planet. We'll be sending you an email shortly titled A Raw Food Education Opportunity for You, where we'll invite you to sign up for a time to speak with us to answer any questions you may have about the curriculum and the structure of the class to help determine if it's a good fit for you. You can also click on the schedule link that's on your screen right now. We look forward to speaking with you about your health goals and how mastering raw food nutrition can help you achieve them. Now we're going to take a 5-minute intermission, and after that, we'll be back to answer your questions. In the meantime, please feel free to sign up for a time to speak with us.